Hello, and welcome to an episode of Zilog and Moto that I'm trying to rush and get done before I go out of town for the weekend. Am I going to get it done on time? Who knows, but if you are seeing this on Monday morning, then I must have been successful. In all seriousness though, if you're not familiar with the channel, you might be wondering what it is exactly that I'm trying to get done in this shorter than normal time span. Well, every week, or so, sometimes these videos take slightly longer to put together, I'm reviewing a game from the English language libraries of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. Essentially, if you can play it in and around a Genesis, and I can read what's on the screen, no matter where the game was originally released around the world, I'm trying to collect a physical copy of it, and then not just let it sit and collect dust on some shelf, but play it on original hardware and then put together my thoughts on the game, including a look at the package, to really take a look and see what it might have been like to play the game 30 years or so ago. This week, it's a pretty thrilling release that I'm sure everyone out there is just dying to learn more about. It was such a big deal back in the 90s that it got 2 separate releases on the console, so that sales could be carried into the late 90s and into the twilight of the Genesis lifespan. And that, of course, is Monopoly from Parker Brothers and Sculptured Software, which was originally released in September of 1992. What, you're not excited about Monopoly? It's only the home version of one of the most popular board games of all time. It sold over 275 million copies since its original release in 1935, and has versions in over 100 countries around the world in at least 37 different languages. If you ask the average person on the street, hey, do you know what Monopoly is? They're going to say, of course I know what Monopoly is. It's that boring game that always goes on for way too long and starts fights between close friends and family all over thimbles and wheelbarrows and Canadian money. Yeah, okay, you're right. Monopoly is definitely not the most exciting game that I could have picked to review this week on the channel, but in my defense, the goal of the channel is to review every English language release for the aforementioned consoles, and not just the good or interesting ones. If I can review big name releases like Art Alive, Where's Waldo, or even Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia, well then something like Monopoly is going to be just a drop in the bucket, and I should have no problem trying to fill 20 minutes with this one. And hey, technically I've already reviewed the Master System version of Monopoly back in episode 102, so if I did it once, I can do it again. At least that's what I told myself when I reviewed Jeopardy and Jeopardy Deluxe for the Genesis. Now that was rough. If you ever wondered why I wait 100 episodes to review games that are in the same series, this is exactly why. Writing one of these scripts is hard enough, much less running it back. Thankfully, along with the about 2 years that I've had since reviewing the Master System version to allow myself to have a new perspective on the game, the Master System and Genesis versions of Monopoly are actually a bit different, and I'll get into that further on in the review. However, does different in this case mean better? And what potentially new things could Sculptured Software include here to make at the time, a 60-year-old board game more interesting? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package. And this is my copy of Monopoly for the Genesis. I mentioned earlier that this game was released twice in the United States, and this is the re-release version from Ballistic, aka Accolade, who I'm guessing just licensed the title from Parker Brothers to try to make some money in the later budget era of the Majesco Genesis 3. The original version comes in a standard clamshell and has essentially the exact same cover art. And while normally I prefer having the original releases of these titles, in this case I couldn't pass this one up because, as you can see, it still has the shrink wrap on the outside. If I ever did want to double dip on this title and pick up the original version though, it wouldn't set me back much, as complete copies sell regularly for $10 or less, ironically still cheaper than this one sold for new apparently. Getting back to this copy, with the shrink wrap still covering the outside, as you can imagine it's in fantastic shape. And before you ask, this was not a sealed copy that I opened for this review. Someone had smartly just sliced open the wrap at the bottom of the box so that the inner tray could be slid in and out. I love seeing that price tag on the top of the box showing that this came from Toys R Us originally. Or, I guess, just R Us? I don't know if that's a printing error or what, but what I do know is that this was apparently part of the 1998 budget Christmas season, with the price tag having a November of 1998 date at the top. Not sure how many copies of this Toys R Us managed to move at that late date, considering that the Dreamcast was less than a year away at that point, but this was apparently one of them. As far as the front cover goes, it's decent, and about what you would expect from a Monopoly game, with rich Uncle Pennybags strolling down the Atlantic Avenue area of the board, complete with, and this is something that I didn't pick up on until doing research for the video, check out that monogrammed suitcase with rich Uncle Pennybags, or RUP, on the side of it. That's the attention to detail that I like to see on a cover. Monopoly was released as a North American exclusive for the Genesis, so there's no alternate covers from other countries floating around, but this version of the game did also appear on the Game Boy, NES, Super NES, and then years later the Game Boy version was reimagined for the Game Boy Color. For the Game Boy and NES versions, Parker Brothers elected to go with a decidedly more old-school cover, and then the Super Nintendo version got an expanded version of the same artwork used on the Genesis due to the extra horizontal space available. All of these covers are nice, but I think I prefer the Genesis one, just due to it being clean and taking up the whole area on the cover, minus the small border on the bottom. Flipping over the back, and this layout is decent, but there's not a ton going on. And unfortunately, the screenshots are a bit rough, but at least they were smart enough to go for some variety, considering how much of the time that you're going to spend looking at the game board during a game. The funny part is, the screenshot on the right showing what happens if a property goes up for auction? Yeah, I never saw it during my playthrough, and I almost wonder how many people never will see it, just due to normally that not occurring, especially when playing with computer opponents. On the inside of the package, there's the tray with cartridge and manual, and thankfully, since this is a Ballistic re-release rather than Majesco, they kept the original manual with color cover, complete with an ad for Clue on the back, which Ballistic also picked up for re-release. The manual is very nicely laid out with lots of screenshots and completely explains the game and all of its preset game modes, and even has a separate section at the back that fully explains the rules to Monopoly, just in case you're not clear on how out-of-the-box rules for Monopoly are set because you've been playing some crazy made-up house rules your entire life. Okay, that's the package. Let's play some Monopoly and see if it's better than pulling out a dusty old box. I mentioned previously that this particular edition of Monopoly was released for the NES, Game Boy, Super NES, and of course Genesis, but I didn't mention anything about the Master System, which makes sense because this game was originally released in September of 1992, and the Master System was long dead at that point. But what about the Master System version of Monopoly then, that came out 4 years earlier in 1988? You know, the one I reviewed back in episode 102. Well, that was a totally separate release that came about when Sega was desperate for games on the Master System due to Nintendo basically trying to strangle the Master System out of existence by forcing third parties to only release games for the Nintendo consoles. The Master System version, from a development and publishing perspective, is totally separate from these later releases, as Sega had licensed the publishing rights to Monopoly for the Master System release from Parker Brothers through their Tonka distribution connection, rather than the game being published directly by Parker Brothers, as would be the case for this Genesis release. However, the more important fact is that for the Genesis, and other platforms edition, the game was developed by Sculptured Software rather than Nexa, who was of course also known for Alf. Yeah, let's just move on. Sculptured Software was an experienced developer at that point who had been in business since 1984, and had worked on all sorts of ports and original games for various platforms, and would eventually be acquired by Acclaim in 1995 due to their solid reputation. So far on the channel, I've reviewed 3 of their titles, all for the Genesis: Pac-Mania, WWF Super WrestleMania, and that reminds me, I need to get the rest of the WWF games on the review schedule. It's time for the next one. Oh, and also Risk. I'm just going to be honest, their Genesis catalog isn't exactly impressive for the most part, although interestingly enough, they were the development house responsible for the port of Capcom's The Punisher, I suppose because Capcom didn't want to waste in-house resources on the 16-bit titles in 1995. Of those 3 games previously mentioned, Pac-Mania and WWF Super WrestleMania were fine, but Risk still leaves a foul taste in my mouth almost 5 years later. I feel like that's important to point out considering that this review is for the port of another board game. However, just because Monopoly is based on a board game, it's also a wildly different board game, and as always, I'm trying to go into these reviews with the game having a clear slate. Upon booting up the game, you're introduced to a shot of rich Uncle Pennybags taking a stroll down the Monopoly Street, which sits in the background, not unlike the art on the cover of the box. You then get prompted to choose the number of players in the game, from 1 to 8, and to set how many of the players are humans, and then how many are controlled by the computer. For the human players, you're allowed to set your name for your character and then pick which of the 8 Monopoly pieces you want to use. Either the hat, battleship, iron, thimble, dog, wheelbarrow, car, or shoe, all of which are pieces that you're probably familiar with depending on which edition of the game that you grew up playing. And then for the computer players, you can go through and pick from 8 different preset characters to play against, with the computer picking their game piece. For one difference here between the Master System version and the Genesis version, the Master System version actually supported up to 10 players rather than just 8. So I suppose it could be argued that that's something that's in the Master System's favor. However, unless you're involving computer players, anything over 4 seems a bit excessive to me, as the more players that are involved, the more ways that properties are going to get split up initially, extending the length of a game, which can already take a considerable amount of time to play. Having said that, that leads me to the second major difference between the Master System and Genesis versions, and that's something that definitely is better about the Master System version, and that's the existence of battery backup for save games. Now, granted, none of the ports of the Parker Brothers sculptured software version of Monopoly have this feature, so don't think I'm picking on the Genesis version specifically, but this is something that I have to call out when an 8-bit version of a game from 4 years previous has not just a better feature, but an incredibly useful feature that could have helped the Genesis version to be a more complete game. If you're not overly familiar with Monopoly, you may not understand why I'm making such a big deal about battery backup for a board game. The reason why I mention this is because Monopoly is notorious for being a game that takes a long time to play, if you actually play it to completion, rather than just having players get bored and give up. And don't just take it from me. According to Wikipedia, the average session of Monopoly is between 180 to 2,000 minutes. That translates from 3 to 33 1/3 hours. Now, granted, an electronic version of Monopoly might run a bit faster due to the computer handling all the math and bank duties, but it's still a game that is going to take some time to have a complete full session. And unfortunately with the Genesis version, you have no choice but to grind it out or just cut your losses and end early if you don't have time to find a winner. It's not the end of the world, but it really would have been nice for the Genesis version to have had that feature, since it clearly wasn't too complicated to add, and since there's no save game function, at least the developers included the option to change a player from human to computer, so that if someone has to go, but everyone else wants to keep the party going, they can. However, while the Genesis version doesn't have battery backup, it does have a nice new feature in being able to customize the game before you start play. So rather than just always play a vanilla version of Monopoly where everyone starts out with $1,500 and no properties, you can configure how much money or properties a player starts out with, where a player starts the game from on the board, and even if the player starts out with any houses or hotels if that player is starting out with a color set. And if that's too much trouble, the game also features 12 different preset modes that are usable for 2 to 4 player games, to allow you to get started quick while also shaking things up a bit. There's also a quick mode, which allows you to basically configure a game session for sudden death to automatically end after a certain amount of time and giving the player with the most cash and assets at that point in the game the win. And I can definitely see situations where this will come in handy to cut off the pay rent death spiral that often happens toward the end of games. And if you've played Monopoly the board game, you know what I mean. In testing out Monopoly this week, I set up a game between myself and 7 other computer players just to see what would happen. The AI isn't great, but it's competent enough to play the game, and there were times during the game, after all the properties had been bought up, that computer players would attempt to either trade with me or with other computer players, giving the game a somewhat realistic feel, as there were often times the computer would refuse to trade with itself, with no collusion between artificial players. I even liked how sometimes when the computer would attempt to trade with me, They would just offer up a property and no specific request, in a sort of name your price gambit to gauge if I was interested. At first this was a little confusing, but then I really appreciated what was going on, and it was definitely a nice change of pace to just constantly having players move around the board and not really attempt to win the game. From a graphics standpoint, I mean, if you were buying Monopoly back in 1992, I would hope that you wouldn't have too high of expectations compared to other titles on the market. The game board looks about like you would expect, except that it is slightly stretched horizontally to take up all of the available space on the 4x3 display, which does look a bit odd at first. The game tracks all of the individual pieces as they move around the board, and the houses and hotels are marked so you know exactly how much trouble you're going to be in for if you land on one. Each of the chance and community chess cards have small animations that go with them, which is nice, and I like how in the center of the board there's animations showing the players moving around the board and where they're going to end up at. I even like the mildly disturbing disembodied hand that comes out when you're going to go roll the dice. It's not much, but it's a nice touch to make it seem like you're actually playing the board game versus just hitting a random number generator. Those are probably the high points graphically though, because in other areas, like in the property screen and when you're going to set up trades between players, the layout is incredibly rudimentary, and honestly looks like something that you would see on a Commodore 64, which would be fine if this was the Commodore 64 version that was originally released in December of 1984 by Leisure Genius, but it's not. The sound isn't much to speak of either. It's not bad, mind you, it's just that there's not a whole ton of it. Most of the game is based around digital sound effects, and to their credit, the sound effects sound nice and crisp, like the roll of the dice or the cash register that munches your cash when you have to pay rent or a utility bill. Other than that though, the game is relatively silent, albeit with the occasional brief musical fanfare thrown in when something special happens, like passing go or picking up a card. And I get the problems that could occur from trying to have background music and it not be repetitive for a game where a session will probably take over an hour at least. My test game ran about 2.5. But it would be nice to at least have it as an option that could be turned off. I think I'm landing on the stance that Monopoly on the Genesis is fine. It's certainly a much better game than Sculptured Software's Port of Risk, which is a bit disappointing, at least on the Risk side, because I actually prefer Risk to Monopoly from a board game standpoint. And I did enjoy my time taking on the computer, and I can imagine a similar experience for playing against humans, other than having to pass the controller around, since it's only set up for one, no matter how many players are configured. And I've got to be honest, losing the battery backup feature in the Master System version, which I thought was a brilliant addition, is a bit of a bummer, but at least it does include the customized feature with either having manual or preset game modes. As a result, I'm giving Monopoly on the Genesis 2 stars. It's perfectly serviceable for what it is, but don't expect some miracle that's going to make it more entertaining than playing the physical version.
Okay, and that was Monopoly for the Genesis. I'll be honest, I didn't think I was going to be able to get this one done before I went out of town this last weekend, but thankfully I didn't have any weird technical issues crop up, and writing about the game was actually a lot easier than I was expecting, as I thought it might be a struggle to have to write about the game again, but it was actually a nice process, and I had totally forgotten this copy still had the shrink wrap on the outside of the box, so that was nice to rediscover. And playing the computer was actually fun. It was very amusing to see the computer beat up on itself while I kind of just whistled and, kind of waited my turn over in the corner. Anyway, next time on Zilog and Moto, well, it appears that I've got an open spot in the schedule. However, when you see this video, I'll be driving back from a trip to the southeast that's going to see me stop at a few retro game stores. So maybe we'll just leave that slot open for now and see what I come back with. Maybe I can find something that I don't already have without having to resort to eBay, and I'll take a look at that. We'll see. But there's definitely at least one store in the Atlanta area that I didn't have time to hit back in December that I'm looking forward to stopping in. So, fingers crossed. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 203. If you liked what you saw here and you want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.